My name is Anna Matthews. I was a Christian my whole life, until the night I died and discovered Jesus wasn't pleased with me. For as long as I can remember, my identity was wrapped in faith. I was baptized, I served in ministry, I prayed aloud in church meetings, and people said I was a woman of God. I thought my place in heaven was secure. I thought my name was written in the Lamb's Book of Life in permanent ink. But I was wrong. The night I crossed over, Jesus showed me the truth. Not about the world, not about my neighbors, not even about the people who had hurt me, but about myself. And what I saw terrified me. Because despite all my good works, all my devotion, and all my years of service, I was standing on the edge of eternal loss. Not because of murder, not because of theft, not because of adultery, but because of a single sin I carried without even realizing it. Jesus told me this sin will keep millions out of heaven. Millions of believers who look holy on the outside but are far from Him on the inside. And I was one of them. It was a sin I thought was small, almost invisible, but in His presence it burned like fire. This is the story of how I died, what I saw, and the shocking truth Jesus revealed to me. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina. My parents were devoted Christians, faithful in church attendance, strict with morals, generous with their giving. Sunday morning wasn't a question in our house, it was a command. I accepted Jesus as my Savior when I was 10 years old, during a children's revival service. I walked down the aisle trembling, repeated the sinner's prayer after the pastor, and felt a warmth I couldn't describe. At 13, I was baptized in the church's small white baptismal pool. I remember the water rushing over me, the congregation clapping as I came up smiling, my father nodding with pride from the front pew. From that day forward, I thought of myself as a Christian, secure and settled. As I grew, I leaned into that identity. I joined the youth choir, played flute in the worship band, and volunteered in children's ministry. By the time I was in college, I was known as the church girl. Professors respected me, classmates admired me, and parents pointed me out to their daughters as an example of godly living. I married Mark, a man as devoted to the church as I was. Together we built a family that looked, from the outside, like the perfect Christian household. We prayed before meals, took our children to Sunday school, hosted Bible studies in our living room, and spent holidays volunteering at shelters. If anyone asked, I was a model believer. I taught women's Bible study, led worship on Sunday mornings, even spoke at conferences about Christian marriage and parenting. People admired me, and secretly, I admired myself. But there were cracks forming beneath the polished image. I thought Christianity was about proving myself holy. About being the one who never missed church, who never slipped up, who always looked spiritual. I wore my devotion like a badge, and the more people praised me for it, the more I believed I was righteous. I didn't see it then, but pride was slipping in, masked as holiness, dressed up as faithfulness. I was comparing myself constantly, measuring my walk with God against the weaknesses of others. Instead of leaning on His grace, I was leaning on my record. It all looked perfect on the outside. But heaven does not measure perfection the way we do. For years, nobody could see the cracks forming in me. Not even I could see them clearly. Pride doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It doesn't wear horns or claws. It creeps in quietly, hiding behind the language of holiness, disguising itself as zeal. One of the first signs appeared when I was in my early 30s, teaching Sunday school at Riverside Church. I remember a girl named Kelsey, barely 20, who had just recommitted her life to Christ after years of rebellion. She still wore short skirts, still had tattoos on her arms, still spoke too casually during prayer requests. Everyone else praised her for coming back to the Lord, but I saw only the mess. She has a long way to go, I whispered to another leader after class, shaking my head. You can't just erase years of sin overnight. On the surface, it sounded like discernment. In reality, it was judgment. What I didn't admit was how secretly satisfied I felt comparing my clean record to her broken past. Then there was a single mother in our congregation, Maria. She came faithfully to church with 2 little boys who were often restless in the pew. I smiled at her in public, but behind closed doors with my friends, I criticized her. She shouldn't even be in ministry, I once said, rolling my eyes. If she'd made better choices, she wouldn't be struggling now. I wrapped my words in religious concern, but the truth was uglier. I wanted to believe her failures confirmed my own strength. And when people stumbled publicly, when a deacon's son was caught drinking, when a worship leader's marriage fell apart, when a family quietly left the church after a scandal, I found myself feeling something no Christian should ever feel. A rush of self-justification. Relief that it wasn't me. Almost a perverse sense of triumph. I never said it aloud, but the thought pulsed beneath the surface. I'm not perfect, but at least I'm better than them. It was the same spirit Jesus described in Luke 18, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee stood in the temple and prayed, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people." And there I was, serving, smiling, leading worship, while whispering those same words in my heart. Pride was my silent companion. It gave me a twisted sense of security. I thought my dedication, my service, and my outward discipline made me more worthy of God's favor. And the more others stumbled, the taller I stood in my own mind. But pride never stays quiet forever. It seeps into everything. I remember one Bible study where a young woman confessed through tears that she was struggling with pornography. The room grew silent. I forced a sympathetic smile, prayed for her, and said all the right words. But in my heart, I recoiled. How could she let herself sink so low? That night, as I washed dishes, I actually felt proud of myself for never wrestling with such dirty sins. I didn't see that my prideful comparison was dirtier still. In church meetings, I found subtle ways to highlight my service. I'd casually mention how many hours I'd spent preparing for a lesson, or how much we'd given to missions that year. I wanted people to notice my dedication, to see me as the steadfast one. Every compliment from a pastor or church member was like fuel for the idol I was building, an idol with my own name written on it. The cracks were widening. Outwardly, I was respected. Inwardly, I was exalting myself over others. And the frightening part? Nobody questioned me, because pride wears the mask of devotion so well. Looking back, I see it clearly. I was living the parable Jesus warned about. The Pharisee congratulated himself for fasting, for tithing, for standing above the sinners around him. The tax collector, broken and humble, simply cried out for mercy, and went home justified. But I was no tax collector. I was the Pharisee in a dress, Bible in hand, singing louder than everyone else while silently thanking God that I wasn't like them. And that sin, hidden behind my hymns and service, was growing stronger every year. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind you never expect to become the doorway into eternity. I had just finished preparing notes for another women's Bible study. The house was quiet, my husband had already gone to bed, and I sat in the living room sipping tea, feeling proud of the lesson I'd crafted. Then it struck. A crushing weight in my chest, sudden and merciless. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. My breath caught like a rope tightening around my lungs. I tried to call out for help, but no sound came. My heart thundered once, twice, and then it stopped. The room dissolved. I wasn't on the floor anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind that's empty, but the kind that is alive, thick, weighty, absolute. Time itself seemed to fold. I didn't feel seconds passing, only a vast stillness that stretched in every direction. And then came the awareness. Every mask I had ever worn, every role I played as the good Christian woman, was gone in an instant. I wasn't Anna the Bible study leader, Anna the choir singer, Anna the ministry worker. I was Anna the soul, naked before eternity. Every secret thought, every hidden motive, every prideful whisper of my heart was exposed. That's when I saw him. Jesus. But not the Jesus I had pictured in Sunday school illustrations, gentle and soft-eyed. Not even the kind I imagined when singing hymns about his mercy. He was radiant, terrifying in holiness, beautiful beyond comprehension. His very presence pulsed with purity. His robe shimmered with a light that seemed to be alive, and his face was set with the authority of eternity. But it was his eyes that undid me. They were like fire and oceans all at once, searching deeper than bone and marrow, piercing past every excuse I had ever told myself. With one look, I knew that he saw it all. Every time I judged another believer, every moment of secret satisfaction when someone stumbled, every thought that elevated myself above others, it was all laid bare before him. I collapsed at his feet, though my body wasn't really a body anymore. It was as if my very soul was bowing under the weight of truth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't comparing myself to anyone else. I wasn't holding up my service hours, my worship songs, my faithful attendance as proof of devotion. I was simply undone. There was no hiding here. No pretending. No masks, no titles, no applause. Just me and the raw, unfiltered reality of who I was. When he spoke my name, it was both thunder and tenderness at the same time. Anna. I trembled. That one word carried the weight of my entire existence. You called me Lord, he said, his voice both grief and authority. But your heart was far from me. In that moment, I realized something that shook me to the core. All my years of serving, singing, and teaching had never been about him. Not really. They had been about me, about looking righteous, about being admired, about proving I was better than the rest. His gaze didn't just reveal what I'd done. It revealed why I'd done it. And that truth was more devastating than death itself. I had stood before people polished and applauded. But before Jesus, I stood exposed, and there was nothing in me to boast of, only pride, and it burned in his presence like a stain I could not hide. As I knelt trembling before him, I thought the exposure of my own heart would be the end. But Jesus was not finished. With a movement of his hand, the space around us shifted, and suddenly I was no longer standing alone. I saw multitudes. Millions upon millions of faces stretched across a vast horizon. They were familiar, not personally, but in the way you recognize family. They were Christians. People who sang worship songs, who carried Bibles, who filled pews on Sunday mornings. They looked like believers, sounded like believers, lived like believers. But then the ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, they kept lifting their hands in worship, smiling, clapping. But as the earth split open, their faces twisted in horror. One by one, they slipped, not into fire or smoke, but into something worse, an endless darkness where God was not. A void so empty it crushed the soul more than flames ever could. I cried out, Lord, who are they? They called on your name. They served you. His eyes, filled with sorrow deeper than oceans, turned toward me. They called me Lord, but their hearts were lifted in pride. They trusted in their own goodness, not in my grace. He drew me closer into the vision, and what I saw next left me trembling. There was a deacon I recognized from every church I'd ever been in. He wore the right suit, carried the right Bible, sat on the right board. Week after week, he stood tall as an example of discipline. But Jesus let me see his heart, and it was full of disdain. I saw him glance at the poor who entered the sanctuary, judging their worn clothes and tired eyes, whispering to others that they needed to work harder. He had never lifted a finger to help, but had convinced himself that looking down on them was righteousness. Next, I saw a woman who filled social media with Bible verses. Her posts gathered likes and comments about how faithful she was, how inspiring her words seemed. But behind closed doors, her tongue was a blade. She mocked new believers when they slipped, laughed at women in the church who struggled, tore down those who confessed weakness. Her Bible verses were a mask, her heart was poisoned with judgment. Then there was a pastor. His sermons were polished, his theology sound, his church filled with eager listeners. But beneath his eloquence was a hidden thought: I am holier than they are. Each mistake he noticed in his congregation became fuel for his private sense of superiority. He compared their weakness to his discipline, their doubts to his certainty, their struggles to his apparent strength. Outwardly, he shepherded them. Inwardly, he exalted himself above them. These weren't villains. They were the respected ones, the admired, the applauded, the people others followed as examples of faith. Yet all of them were slipping into that terrible void. I turned back to Jesus, shaking. But they served you. They prayed. They gave. How could pride undo it all? His voice was steady, but his face bore grief, because pride is worship turned inward. It makes self the god. They honored me with their lips, but their hearts exalted themselves above others. They loved the seat of honor more than the posture of humility. They trusted in their own goodness, not in my blood. And no one enters my Father's house by their own goodness. The words cut deeper than any sword. Suddenly, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector became living reality. The Pharisee, standing tall, thanking God that he wasn't like the sinners around him, that was me. That was them. That was millions. And all the while, the tax collector, broken and humble, went home justified. Jesus continued, his tone both final and compassionate: prideful judgment is the hidden chain that binds the church. It looks like holiness, but it is poison. It sings about grace but refuses to live it. It hears my words but filters them through self-righteousness. And unless it is cast down, it will keep millions out of heaven. The vision began to fade, but its weight pressed against me. I could still see faces, faces of people who thought they were safe, faces of people who looked like me. And I knew, without question, that I was one of them. The sin wasn't murder. It wasn't theft. It wasn't adultery. It was pride. Pride disguised as holiness. Pride wrapped in Bible verses. Pride that compared, judged, and secretly rejoiced in being better. And in that moment, I understood the terrible truth: prideful judgment is not just a flaw, it is a path that leads straight away from God's presence. After showing me the multitudes, Jesus turned his gaze back to me. His eyes burned with a love so fierce it stripped away every excuse I might have spoken. Then he lifted his hand, and suddenly, I was seeing scenes from my own life. The first was in a church foyer years earlier. A young couple had come in late, their clothes rumpled, their children restless. I remembered whispering to another woman beside me, "Pray for them, they're struggling." It sounded spiritual, but Jesus showed me the truth. My words weren't compassion. They were gossip, disguised as concern. My heart wasn't lifting them up, it was lifting me up, painting myself as the stable one in contrast to their weakness. Next, I saw myself at a women's retreat. A single mother had spoken about her struggles with faith and finances. I hugged her afterward, told her I'd be praying for her. But in my heart, I kept my distance. I saw her as broken beyond repair, someone beneath my standard. Jesus let me feel the coldness I carried that day, the subtle superiority that robbed my kindness of its meaning. Then came the hardest one. I was in my kitchen, years earlier, when news spread that a respected elder in our church had fallen into sin. I remembered setting down my dish towel, breathing out a quiet thought: at least it wasn't me. I hadn't said it aloud, but Jesus replayed it for me. The secret satisfaction. The smug relief. The way my pride fed off his failure like a parasite. I wept. Lord, I didn't know. But he shook his head gently. You did. My spirit whispered, but you silenced him. Your heart was far from me. You honored yourself more than me. You wanted to be admired for holiness more than you wanted to be humble in my presence. Every good work I thought I had done was poisoned by that pride. My songs, my lessons, my prayers, they had been about me. And in his presence, I finally saw them for what they were, ashes in the wind. The vision dissolved, and I felt myself being pulled away. The radiance of his presence faded, replaced by a strange weight pressing against my chest. Voices pierced the silence. Urgent, frantic. Clear. A jolt like fire surged through me. My eyes flew open. Bright lights, masked faces, the harsh beeping of machines. I was lying in a hospital bed, wires and tubes covering me. My husband was at my side, his eyes swollen with tears. Anna, he whispered, gripping my hand, you were gone. 10 minutes, no pulse, no breath. They said you wouldn't make it back. His voice cracked. But you did. It's a miracle. The doctors hovered nearby, shaking their heads in disbelief. They spoke of survival rates, brain damage, statistics. But none of their explanations mattered. I knew why I was alive. I hadn't just been revived. I had been sent back. The joy in my family's eyes was real, but inside me was a weight heavier than any physical pain. Because what I had seen wasn't just a vision for me, it was a warning for all. I carried it now like fire in my bones. Yes, my body had been rescued. But my soul had been confronted. And I could never live the same again. In the days after I left the hospital, I couldn't escape the weight of what I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, the vision of those millions falling into darkness replayed in my mind. And every time I remembered his words, your heart was far from me, I felt the sting all over again. The first person I confessed to was my husband. Sitting at our kitchen table, I told him everything, the pride, the judgment, the secret satisfaction I'd carried for years. His face softened as tears welled in his eyes. Anna, he whispered, I always knew you held yourself to impossible standards. I just didn't know how heavy it had become. He took my hands. We'll walk through this together. Then came my children. It was humbling, painful, even, to admit to them that their mother had been wrong. I had raised them with rules and expectations, but not enough grace. I told them how often I had compared them to others, thinking it was discipline when it was really pride. They forgave me, but not without tears. That night, for the first time in years, we prayed as a family with honesty instead of performance. At church, the confession was harder still. I stepped down from teaching Bible study, not because I no longer believed the word, but because I needed to live it before I taught it again. I told the congregation about my experience, about the pride that had poisoned even my best works. Some listened with wide eyes, broken and convicted. Others shook their heads, muttering that I was being too extreme. Pride always resists exposure. So I began again, not as a leader, not as a model, but as a servant. Quiet acts of humility, washing dishes at church dinners without being asked, sitting beside the single mother I once judged, holding her boys so she could worship freely. I prayed blessings over the people I had once envied or criticized. I found ways to give without recognition, to love without comparison, to pray without letting pride twist my words. It wasn't easy. Pride doesn't die quickly. But every act of humility became a small victory, a reminder that grace, not performance, was my anchor. And then came the fruit. Months later, I received a letter from a woman who had heard me speak at a small gathering. She confessed that she had spent years silently resenting other women in her church, masking her bitterness with Bible knowledge and outward faith. When I heard your story, she wrote, I realized I was no different. That night, I repented. I asked God for humility. And for the first time in decades, I felt His presence again. Her letter reminded me why I had been sent back. Not to boast about a vision, not to parade a miracle, but to warn, because the very sin I carried in silence is the one sin dragging millions away from the presence of God. I am alive today, but not the same woman I once was. Death stripped me of every illusion, and Jesus showed me what truly matters. It isn't murder, theft, or adultery that will keep the church pews empty in heaven, it's pride. Not the pride we boast about, but the pride we hide. The pride that dresses itself in holiness, that prays loudly while whispering judgment, that secretly rejoices when others stumble. Millions will miss heaven not because they didn't know Jesus, but because they thought they didn't need His mercy as much as others did. They trusted their own goodness. They measured their faith by comparison. And their hearts, like mine, were far from Him. So I leave you with this question, not whether you go to church, or how often you serve, or how loudly you sing. The question is simpler, and infinitely harder. Are you humble before Christ? Because in the end, that may be the only thing that matters.